Hi, it's Shan Wu with the Undercolor of Law analysis of a recent important disinvitation, kind of a cancel culture thing. It shows us how Trump and his would-be members of his regime want to condition the military to become part of their following, same way they want to condition their followers. They have made their plans clear in writings like Project 2025 about how important it is for the government and military to be full of loyalists. But how do you make them loyalists? To get there, you have to create them. You have to indoctrinate them. You want to indoctrinate them with disinformation, which isn't just limited to giving them the wrong or disputing truthful information. It's also created by not giving certain information, withholding exposure to certain points of views. Now, sometimes we call that censorship, but it's important to remember that by definition, censorship is really where there's an authority doing the censorship. Sometimes we talk about we're censoring each other, someone is censoring me. A private person can't really do that, but a government certainly can. And particularly with an authoritarian established government, they want to very much control what can be said and what can't be said. So some light was shown on this issue with the military, the potential for it, by the Baltimore Banner paper via Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Rick Hutzel. He was the former editor of the Capital Gazette, where there was that terrible mass shooting. Now, he talked about what happened here in an opinion piece about the U.S. Naval Academy disinviting the NYU historian Ruth Ben-Ghiat from a lecture there. Take a look at what the headline was. So Professor Ghiat is a historian, and she lectures about strongmen and the history of dictatorships in modern times. And this particular lecture was an annual one that's given at the U.S. Naval Academy. It's a memorial lecture in honor of their founder. And it really seems a particularly appropriate topic because the professor was going to talk about what happens to the military under authoritarian regimes. But the lecture got canceled because there was conservative pressure put on the Naval Academy over the professor's, quote, politics, and for her academic analysis that she's published in showing the analogies of Trump's actions to other dictatorships and other authoritarian actions. So I have great respect for Rick Hutzel as a journalist and as a person, but I would differ with one view he took in his piece, which was the idea that the Naval Academy canceled the professor's speech over her politics, because that implies that she was a commentator with very strong opinions about politics, perhaps. But her politics weren't at issue. This wasn't going to be a lecture about someone making the point, which would be valid in an academic setting, that Trump's policies are bad or the vice president's policies are better, one party is better than the other. She was an academic talking about historical facts. And I think it would have been perfectly fine for her to include in her lecture how Trump is similar to prior dictators and current dictators. That's what she's written about. But that's not even what she was going to be speaking about. Here's the actual flyer that was circulated about what her topic was going to be. So in her Substack newsletter, she actually announced just what she would be talking about. I'm quoting from that. I will be speaking about what happens to militaries under authoritarian rule, touching on fascist Italy, Pinochet's Chile, and the Russian notary during the war on Ukraine. End of quote. So notice there's no mention of the election or Trump, but that did not stop the conservative forces like the Heritage Foundation and other propaganda pushing people like the Daily Signal, saying that this was a problem that was very partisan. So, for example, Texas Congressman Keith Self made an announcement and sent a letter where he denounces this decision to invite what he calls a partisan speaker. He claims that allowing attacks on a candidate less than 2 months from the election day would destroy the foundation of this historic lecture, now holding aside the fact that there doesn't seem to be anything about the lecture at an academic academy that needs to be censored. It's not a partisan speech. He then goes on to invoke a Department of Defense directive that prohibits members of the military, including administrators and teachers at service academies, from engaging in partisan political activities. And he concludes that letting the Naval Academy sponsor this lecture amounts to an official endorsement of a partisan agenda. And put up the screenshot of the letter from him. So following up on his letter, he complained and sent the letter to the actual Naval Academy, and they ended up putting the lecture on hold. According to the Naval Academy spokesperson, they did this to avoid the appearance of violating federal law, which it would not have been a violation of federal law. But what really gets me is the quote from the spokesperson, who says, quote, "Our focus is on how to think, not what to think." Really? I would point out that if it's kind of hard to learn how to think, if you don't have anything to think about, right? Because you have to learn about things in order to think about them. She's trying to make it sound like, oh, this is a military service academy, and therefore, we can't talk about topics that might make people think too much. We just train them to follow orders, some nonsense like that. Well, shortly after this little brouhaha came a call from Republicans on the House Armed Services Committee demanding an explanation from the Naval Academy, asking how the Academy defines academic freedom. That's actually a great question, which if the Academy took a look at its own mission and definition of what they are, the answer should be pretty easy for them to figure out. So here's how they describe themselves: as the undergraduate college of our country's naval service. So if you think about that definition, them being an undergraduate college, you will realize that they need to have a very wide variety of topics to cover. I mean, isn't that the kind of thing you want our young military inductees to learn about? History and what role the military played with dictatorships? Kind of sounds to me like the kind of lecture I'd want future military leaders to hear. Now, let's take a listen for a moment to the professor actually speaking in this excerpt, so you just get a flavor for the kind of historical analysis that she gives. So take a listen to that, and we'll talk on the other side.
So they often find an appeal, and many of them, but not all, come from outside the political system. They're very skilled with media and self-presentation. Mussolini was a journalist. Mobutu was a journalist. So these things I'm going to talk about are valid however way they get to power. So one of the conditions that we see over and over again is that they appeal to people as a kind of alpha male rule breaker at times when there's been a lot of social progress. There's been gender emancipation, workers' rights have bettered, racial equity, and this overjoys some people and angers and makes anxious other people. And so these men come up as a kind of check on this, although they also promise to kind of throw everything up for grabs, and they promise to approach politics in a new way. So that's part of it. But one of the things that became very clear to me is that these tactics that they use, the lying and the violence, they use them on the way up. They test out these tools of rule as they get as they're trying to get into office.
Now, she does, in her book and in other parts, make the direct comparison to Trump, but it's not a partisan comparison. She's not like on the campaign trail saying, therefore, look at these comparisons, he's a fascist, etc. She's really doing it from historical analysis. It's just that Trump fits the book exactly to a T, because that's how he's acting. He's acting in the tradition of these strongman dictators. Again, I think this would have been really valuable for the Academy cadets to hear. I'd certainly prefer that they hear this kind of lecture rather than a lecture from this guy. But I guess I'm alone in that viewpoint, or at least West Point doesn't agree with me. Because yes, West Point invited Elon Musk to speak to them. Now, I think Rick Hutzel put it really well, that he said that as controversies go, this one was easy to miss because there's so much else going on right now. And he said that it was easy to miss because it took place within the conservative media ecosystem, but it could foreshadow what might happen to the U.S. service academies if Trump is elected next month. And that's exactly the problem is that it happened in the shadows. These conservatives put pressure on the Naval Academy, and they caved. And this was about the only big reporting that came out of it. That's the way that things happen, is behind the scenes. And when people don't know about it, they can't make a big stink about it. What will happen if Trump and his regime gets their way is they'll try to transform the military, starting at the undergraduate level, right? You want to get them young, start training them, making them think, not telling them certain things. Let's not teach them about the history of authoritarians, how they used the military, because that way they won't be thinking about it. The idea there is to transform the military into kind of a one-stop shopping place, a Praetorian Guard. Now, the Praetorian Guard, back in Roman days, has been described by some scholars as equal parts Secret Service, Special Forces, and urban administrators. That's a pretty scary, all-encompassing role. That's why I call it one-stop shopping. But most importantly, of course, they serve the emperor, not the people. And that's what Trump and dictators really want. They want personal loyalty. That's why he was so dissatisfied with the military generals that did serve him. He had a different notion of who they needed to be loyal to. That's why someone like his former chief of staff, General Kelly, when confronted with Trump talking about his admiration for Hitler's generals, Kelly kind of played with Trump, suggesting to him, oh, you probably don't mean Hitler's generals, right? You probably mean Bismarck's generals, knowing full well that Trump would be clueless about exactly who Bismarck was. Now, Kelly was able to do that because Kelly had a good education. He had a broad liberal arts kind of education, so he knew about these kinds of issues. Because that's exactly what totalitarian regimes don't want, is they don't want people to think for themselves. And that starts with not giving them anything to think about and not teaching them how to think about it. That's what the real goal is. So that's it for now. Great to talk to you. Keep those comments and replies coming. Please support this new channel, subscribe to it, and follow me on Twitter, and we'll talk to you soon.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.